Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and I think today's word is, or phrase is, anchors away, because I have our two naval experts with us today, Dwight Hughes and Neil Chatelain. Hello, guys.
Hi, guys.
How's it going?
So delighted to have you both with us today. And the reason I have called on my ringers, the Navy ringers for today's program, is because I've been writing a lot about Vicksburg, and that means a lot of David Dixon Porter, not just Ulysses S. Grant. And so Porter's just a fascinating guy, and I've been wanting to just kind of ask you guys some questions about him, if you guys are up for it.
Of course.
Yeah, shoot, let's do it.
So let me just ask your general impressions of the guy first. Well, let's start there. And Neil, let me ask you to start. Just give us a quick overview of who this dude is.
Yeah, so David Dixon Porter comes from a very prestigious Navy family. So it's not just him, his entire family is sort of involved in the naval service to an extent. His dad is David Porter. He's related to David Farragut, kind of, through some side actions. He spent his entire career in the U.S. Navy up to the Civil War, and then is heavily involved in the Civil War, both the Gulf blockade, the Mississippi River, the Atlantic blockade towards the end of the war. He's one of the Navy's top-ranking admirals, goes to the Naval Academy after the war and helps run that, and then retires as the second full admiral in the history of the United States Navy. So he's got a very prestigious career, a very big naval background that's kind of complicated, and then is one of the biggest influencers of the U.S. Navy in the middle part in the second half of the 19th century. So it's a lot going on with him.
A lot going on with him, Dwight. That's a lot going on.
Yeah, well, interesting thing about Porter is what Navy Secretary Wells said about him when just after he appointed him to the Mississippi River Squadron. And actually, Wells at the beginning of the war didn't entirely trust Porter, and wasn't sure whether he was going to be successful or not. But the words that Wells used over and over again in his diary were things like he was an energetic, driving, fighting officer, such as is wanted for the rough work on the Mississippi, and that's how he characterized him. He has the vim and the dash and the recklessness is perhaps a better word, he says, of Porter. On the other hand, he didn't, he said Porter was obsessively self-promoting, arrogant, not entirely trustworthy with respect to his relationships with his senior officers. And Wells wasn't entirely certain that he was going to be successful. As a matter of fact, in regard to his appointment as the first commander of the Mississippi River Squadron, he said, Wells said, "This is an experiment, and the results are not entirely certain." So a mixed bag.
Mixed bag. Although you could say a lot of those things about any number of Civil War figures, I think. I mean, you start talking about being a shameless self promoter, and like I'm thinking, well, geez, that could be Phil Sheridan, that could be John Brown Gordon. I mean, like there are a lot of folks that could. So do you guys hold that against him necessarily?
It's difficult. He's very connected. He's very politically savvy. He knows what he's doing in a lot of respects. And what's kind of interesting is that he can leverage those connections to get him to advance once the Civil War begins. So he's appointed to command the mortar vessels in the New Orleans expedition, mainly because he came up with the idea by just walking into the Navy Secretary's office saying, "Here's the plan to capture New Orleans, and it's my plan, so make sure my name's on it. So how come I'm not in charge of it?" So he's very self-promoting, which works out for him in the end because he can produce results, and he's willing to work with people on the scene, and those results help carry forth victory for the United States in the war. So he's very much rewarded for his arrogance because his arrogance is coupled with success.
It ain't bragging if it's the truth, right? Dwight, you were going to add something?
Well, yeah, just to look at it from the other side, his first interaction with the war and the Navy was a total disaster, actually. Pretty much of a mix-up. And actually, Secretary of State Seward decided he was going to be the power behind the throne. And he got together with then Army Captain Montgomery Meigs, and they hatched a plan to prevent Fort Pickens in Florida from falling to the Confederates. And they thought this was a much safer plan. And Seward was conspiring behind the scenes with the Confederates and telling them that they weren't going to attack Fort Sumter. And anyway, Seward was going to save the whole business without war. Well, Montgomery Meigs was a neighbor of David D. Porter, then a lieutenant. And so they got together. And the upshot is that an Army captain, a Navy lieutenant, and the Secretary of State hatched a plan to rescue Fort Pickens and kept it entirely secret from the Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy, and got Lincoln to sign a bunch of orders, and and they got conflicting orders for the USS Powhatan, which was a powerful steam frigate, and David Dixon Porter had signed orders from the commander-in-chief to command this frigate in order to rescue Fort Pickens. And Secretary Wells had a plan to rescue Fort Sumter with that same ship, and things got all confused and mixed up. And Wells was not impressed by this whole thing. Fortunately, Wells concluded, and apparently it didn't actually have an effect on the outcome of events because they were overcome by the attack at Fort Sumter. But anyway, Wells was impressed by this, again, of two things. One, that Porter was extremely ambitious and would do almost anything to get ahead, but that he was also extremely capable when he was directed properly, but that he was also not entirely to be trusted.
Right. So, Neil, I want to back up to something you said a second ago, just to help clarify things for our listeners. You'd mentioned that Porter is the son of David Porter, who was a naval figure in the Revolutionary War. Can you just flesh that out for us a little bit in case people are confused?
Yeah, so David Porter was this leader during the Revolution. And actually, what's interesting is that David Porter and David Farragut's father as well were both leaders in this revolution. David Farragut's father is, George Farragut. And that's kind of how the two of them became, quote unquote, related, was that George Farragut went into poverty after in his older age, and basically pawned off his son on David Porter, and David Porter then adopted David Farragut. In fact, David Farragut's name is David Farragut because he took on the name of David from David Porter. But then there's more to it than that. David Dixon Porter worked with his dad, David Porter. Actually, his first assignment in the Navy wasn't in the U.S. Navy, it was in the Mexican Navy in the 1820s. And that's basically because David Porter, the dad, was accused of doing some things, and he demanded a court of inquiry to clear his name in like this court-martial review. And instead of abiding with the court, David Porter, the dad, essentially just quit the U.S. Navy, went and joined the Mexican Navy as one of their top leaders, and he just took his son with him as like a young midshipman in training. And he spent a couple years in Mexico until there was a couple of incidents where he was like, oh, this is kind of dangerous work. Let me send my son back to the United States. And so David Dixon Porter joins the U.S. Navy at the end of the 1820s, already having some naval experience serving in Mexico. So there's very much a longer story there than just him showing up in April 1861 as part of this plan to relieve Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens. There's a much bigger story that goes into his roots, and to me that adds to some of his arrogance as well. His dad was arrogant too. His dad was celebrated as well for doing his own thing, and so that kind of adds to the story of David Dixon Porter acting the way that he does, mainly because his dad did the same similar situation.
Now, for folks who don't know, there's an old Dr. Seuss story called Too Many Daves, and I feel like we're in that story right now between David Porter, David Dixon Porter, David Farragut. I misspoke a moment ago. I think I mentioned that he was David Porter was a Rev War naval figure. He was a War of 1812 guy.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Right.
he's War of 1812, and Farragut's dad's the Rev War guy.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
There we go.
also the Barbary Wars and the Quasi War, they were involved in all of that. Yeah, the father was a real hero at
Look at
that
that, Dwight.
period.
You gave me an excuse to mention John Adams. So you said the quasi war with France that John Adams prevented. There we go.
Yeah, right.
And he had the bust just sitting there
The
ready
only
to go.
bust on my desk is John Adams, which probably would surprise some people. But so David Dixon Porter comes from this background. He's immersed in naval life, naval lore, naval history. So it gives him this certain bit of braggadocio when the Civil War breaks out. Um, and then he is able to propel himself upwards. And it sounds like a great story of sort of like the self-made man, if we kind of look at it that way. Dwight, do you kind of look at him as a self-made guy, or is he really kind of riding the coattails of a lot of important people?
Well, one could say he's a family-made man, and I mean a Navy family, but his talents are very real, and both Wells and Lincoln recognized that fairly early on, and took advantage of that. And Wells would and Lincoln would admit later that their best appointment of senior officers in the Navy, certainly, and with respect to a couple, with the exception of a couple in the Army, was with Farragut first, and then Porter. I mean, his success was very real. His talents were real, and he had a few problems, as they all did, getting there, but he is to be he's been recognized for that.
And Porter actually works under his foster brother Farragut in the New Orleans campaign, as I recall. What was the dynamic between the two of them? Dwight, do you have any insight on that?
Well, I think that they were close as children, and stayed that as adults. And Porter takes credit in his memoirs for having recommended Farragut, who was then a captain, and Porter himself was still a lieutenant, as to command the New Orleans expedition. And Lincoln admits, and Wells admits, that they hadn't really known very much about Farragut, and if Porter hadn't brought him up and recommended him, that he might not have been recognized for the talent that he was. And they worked well together. Porter commanded the mortarboat squadron at New Orleans, and took it on up the river with Farragut in the summer of '62 for the first battle of Vicksburg, which did not succeed because Halleck wouldn't send any troops to support them. And then after that, they kind of went different ways because Farragut was in the West Gulf Squadron. But as far as I know, they stayed pretty close throughout their lives.
Yeah. Neil, insights you want to share?
Yeah, so they were pretty close, and overall, I would say that perhaps one of the reasons that that Porter recommended Farragut for the job for New Orleans was because he knew that in the Navy there's a long history of keeping it in the family, and so it's more of a, well, if I'm not going to get the top job because my rank is too low to command all these ships, maybe if my adopted brother gets the job, hey, I can get the job too. And so, yeah, there's definitely some him using his family connections and his political connections to get what he wants, but very much so, he earns his promotions in the Civil War. He at the very beginning of the war, he's commanding one ship, the Powhatan, and it's off the coast in the Gulf of Mexico. He goes and tries to chase down Raphael Semmes, basically on his own authority. He tries to hunt down the first Confederate commerce raider. He comes up with that plan to capture New Orleans because he spent time surveying the coast, surveying the Mississippi River. So he knows the coastline better than pretty much anybody else. So he's not just bringing I think it's a good idea, let me do it. He's bringing knowledge because he was on the blockade of the Mississippi River in 1861. He had spent time surveying the Mississippi River before the war. So he's one of the people who actually knows what it's like to be on the scene and understands what it's like to survey the entire river and understand the complexities there. So it's not simply just him leveraging his connections. He's also leveraging his skill set to bring about that campaign. And it ultimately resulted in a massive U.S. victory, one of the first major U.S. victories of the war.
Yeah, hard to really understate how important the fall of New Orleans was. When that falls in April of 1862, I mean, that's a game changer. And I think a lot of people sort of overlook what a game changer that was. But why don't you guys put into perspective for me or for our listeners, how much of a game changer you guys think the fall of New Orleans was? Dwight, let me let you start, if you don't mind.
Well, it was a tremendous victory. The first, well, not the first, because we'd done well at Hatteras Inlet and the North Carolina Sounds and Port Royal, but it was the major. New Orleans is actually the largest port in the Confederacy or in the United States, almost. I think. Maybe Neil, you actually being a New Orleans native can speak
New
to more
Orleans,
detail
New
on that than I
Orleans.
can. Yeah.
How do you say that? New Orleansian.
Yeah. Go ahead, Neil.
So fourth
you can
largest
cover
city in
that
the
better than I can, actually.
yeah, largest city in the Confederacy and fourth
By
largest
far.
port. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So it's the largest Confederate port. It's the largest Confederate city. And we're talking about by a lot. All the other major Confederate cities are 15, 20, 30,000 people. New Orleans has 160 something thousand people at the beginning of the war. So it rivals, it's bigger than Chicago is at that point. So it's a massive urban center. It's the biggest industrialized center the Confederacy has. Everybody talks about Richmond with the Tredegar Ironworks and everything. New Orleans had a host of these ironworks. They were manufacturing artillery. They were making orders for tens of thousands of uniforms at a time. One company had an order placed to make 50,000 uniforms at the beginning of the war. Like, name another Confederate town that could produce 50,000 uniforms in one order. It doesn't exist. They had a dozen dry docks that they could use to build ships, repair ships. A host of ships already there. They tried to build 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ironclads there at the beginning of the war in the first year. And very few made it there because of scarcity of supplies and stuff. But New Orleans has this urban center. It has an industrial base, and it has a shipping base that makes it unparalleled. And so when it is captured by the United States, yeah, a lot of that manufacturing gets relocated to places like Atlanta ultimately. And yeah, a lot of the soldiers in garrisoning New Orleans retreat and they make their way to Baton Rouge and then to Vicksburg eventually. But the fact that they don't have those dry docks, the fact that they have to spend time to move all of this infrastructure, it really does hamper the Confederacy's war effort in a major way that most people just don't understand, because most people aren't diving deeper into the logistics side of things as much as they could.
And, of course, I think about the economic toll that took on the Confederacy, like all commerce from the Trans-Mississippi and the Mississippi Valley all the way up into Kentucky all came down through the Mississippi River. And so to cut the port off like that, it really, is just economically devastating for the Confederacy. So big win for the U.S. Navy on that one. So this gets me into a point, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and you guys may have to fish me off this one. And this relates to something Dwight had said, where Porter was well suited for the assignment of the Mississippi Squadron. And it really seems to me like Porter is, personality wise, ideal for brown water operations, whereas Farragut really did seem more of a blue water operations kind of guy. Maybe I'm too far out there, but Any thoughts on that? Like just personality wise, are these guys well suited for where they end up falling?
Well, Porter really did adapt to brown water pretty quickly, and which in retrospect is maybe somewhat surprising because none of the U.S. Navy officers had any experience on brown water. And of operating river steamboats as opposed to ocean-going steam war vessels. And when Secretary Wells, Navy Secretary Wells, initially didn't want anything to do with the Mississippi River campaigns, particularly, he figured that was an Army task, and he was too busy with the blockade and ginning up a few hundred ships to manage that. But then he did send some very capable officers to advise the Army, McClellan at first, and then his successors in the West. And then Grant got together with Flag Officer Foote, and we had Fort Henry and Fort Donelson were great successes. The Navy took Grant down to Shiloh and protected him there, and then we had Island Number 10, and we came down the Mississippi to Memphis and took Memphis and cleared the Mississippi all the way down to Vicksburg. And by the time that happened in the summer of '62, Wells decided, well, maybe maybe this is a Navy asset. And so he and Lincoln and Secretary Stanton decided that they would promote the what was known as the Western Gunboat Flotilla, an Army organization with Navy officers. And having Navy officers assigned to the Army was the first instance of a joint force. That in itself is unprecedented. Navy officers never took orders from Army officers or vice versa, regardless of the rank. That just wasn't done. But anyway, they decided to designate it the Mississippi River Squadron, which was the Navy's senior operational command, equivalent in seniority to the blockading squadrons, which were themselves innovations that the U.S. Navy had never had on that level before, with the newly created rank of admiral in order to command them, because the Navy had never needed admirals before. And so Porter went out there, and he fell in immediately into that environment and adapted to it very quickly. And he took over the ironclads, the tinclads, the timberclads, the dozens and dozens of transports and support vessels, major fleet on an inland waterway, which is something the Navy had never done before. And they essentially invented riverine warfare on the fly. And he and Grant got together and on to Vicksburg.
On to Vicksburg. Neil, thoughts about the Porter as a brown water personality?
Yeah, so I would say his adopted brother Farragut is definitely a blue water personality for sure. People don't really generally know it about Farragut himself, but like he wasn't a fan of ironclads. He had to be convinced to bring ironclads with him to Mobile Bay in 1864. He thought that they were just novelties that were not going to do much good. He never went on ironclads. He always stayed on his wooden steam sloop Hartford as his flagship. He never did those kind of things. Whereas Porter, the best way to equate David Dixon Porter with the Mississippi River is almost like during World War I and World War II, younger junior officers can sense promotion by getting into the riskier business. And so David Dixon Porter says the Mississippi River is this novel concept. I already know a little bit about the river. I'm successful with New Orleans. I'm going to lobby to get command of that squadron, almost like a lot of young junior officers were lobbying for submarine service in World War I and World War II, because a lieutenant or a lieutenant commander could command a submarine, whereas to command a battleship, you need to spend 35, 40 years in the Navy. And so Porter lobbies to get this command of this squadron, and he's promoted from the rank of commander, in 05, the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel, to rear admiral to command this squadron over a whole bunch of people above him. hundreds of officers are more senior to him in the Navy. And so as a result, he gets this squadron command and he feels like he has to do something with it. And well, one of the ways that he does that is through cooperation with Ulysses Grant. He says, well, I'm in charge, but it's not quite my element. It's not quite the Navy's element. And he develops this working relationship with military officers. And very much so, when Porter is on the scene with his ships, those ships cooperate with the Army very well. And sometimes it's not the case, whereas some of his subordinates are working with some of Grant's subordinates, they don't cooperate as much very well. And the Navy captains are like, well, I'm going to take my ships and go back if I have to. But when Porter's on the scene, the ships cooperate. He cooperates well with Grant. And that proves a big game changer when it comes to keeping Grant's army moving, just the logistics of keeping Grant's army supplied, the logistics of requiring escorts for supply steamers and all of these other facets to keep things moving, because Grant has no real base of operations on the Mississippi River unless you go way up to like Memphis or Helena, Arkansas, or something like that. And so he's talking about hundreds of river miles that have to be protected with his warships, while also worrying about Confederate warships and worrying about raids and keeping the supply lines open. And so it's much more of a complex problem than just like send your ships, like in Charleston, send your ships, blow up some forts and capture the city, so to speak. So it's a bigger operation, and I think that his ambition helped him play into, well, I got to work with these guys, so I'm going to make myself look good. But also, it helped him understand that it's a much bigger operation than maybe what some of the other squadron commanders were dealing with, and so he used that to his success.
We're going to talk more about the Grant-Porter relationship, which I think is absolutely key to federal success in the war. But what I'm kind of find amusing is when I talk about brown water personality, blue water personality, you both accepted the premise of the question and answered, and off you went. But maybe our readers don't quite understand, like, what is a brown water personality? What is a blue water personality? And I'm only pretending because I'm not a Navy guy, but you guys are Navy guys, and you guys have both done brown and blue water. Neil, how would you define those terms? And then Dwight, I'll ask you to offer your insights.
Yeah, so when I was in the Navy, I did all of my stuff blue water, which is bigger ships off the coastline, operating in larger formations. Today, that's your carrier strike groups and things like that. Whereas brown water is inland, right off the coast, directly off the coast, on inland waterways. So the water is shallower. The rivers are more congested. The coastline is more congested, and it's just a matter of how are sailors operating. So a good connecting point for that today is the Navy's amphibious ships, where they're trained and operated to move from place to place, but also to get right up to the coastline so they can land Marines and carry out operations. And so there's definitely a difference in the Navy today. People who drive ships, the surface warfare officers, are kind of divided into three main groups. You've got the people who like to do the bigger ships, the shooters is what we call them, the destroyers, the cruisers and whatnot. Then you've got folks who like to do the amphibious ships that get a little bit closer to the water. And then you've got the guys who like to really get into it. We call those guys the riverine guys, the riverine forces today. And that's what Dwight did in Vietnam. So he can talk a lot more about that than I can.
I will quickly add, though, you do have brown water experience. Your fantastic book, Defending the Arteries of Rebellion, which is about the Confederate forces in the Mississippi River Valley, which I just think is fantastic. So yeah, Dwight, you're a brown water guy. Tell me about it.
Well, there really are some striking differences in the technology, the mindset, the skills, the organization needed. And of course, the U.S. Navies were by definition blue water, deep water, ocean going warships primarily. And that's what they did. They fought in fleets and ship on ship duels and so on. And the sailing Navy, of course, never went up rivers if they could avoid it, because sailing up a river is a very difficult thing to do when you're dependent on the wind. And so there was just a difference in thinking patterns here.
Yeah.
And whereas on the Mississippi, the Mississippi just in the last or in the first half of the 19th century, with the steamboat, the Mississippi River steamboat revolution, just revolutionized river commerce in a way that had never been seen before. And by mid-century, you had hundreds of these big river steamboats going up and down the river, but the technology was a bit different. They were shallow draft, they were wide, they were top heavy. The engines were powerful, but they were fairly basic. And the skills required to sail across an ocean and to sail up and down a river were somewhat different. The blue water sailors just weren't used to navigating these rather awkward vessels along narrow channels with sandbanks and snags and sunken vessels and radical changes in weather patterns and depth of water all the time. You really had local skills. You had to have local skills in order to do that. So
And by local skills, you mean like you have to know what the river is right here, like
that's
where
right.
the channels
That's
are,
right.
where the river bends are right here.
That's right. And to a degree not appreciated, the Mississippi River Squadron always relied on local talent in terms of their pilots. And rivermen, they recruited as many rivermen as they could. And actually some of the forces in the Mississippi River Squadron and in the River War were primarily civilians who commanded their own vessels in the Battle of Memphis, for instance, in Mississippi. The Ram fleet, those guys were civilians who were entirely independent of the Navy, and they had their own skills, and they didn't think they needed the Navy, didn't want the Navy. But anyway, Porter brought this all together and assimilated this, and more than that, he really got together with Grant to develop that relationship.
I've been working on a couple Vicksburg volumes for the Casemate Illustrated series coming up. And so that's kind of, my insights into the Mississippi. Like the Mississippi River is a character where you think about like Grant, Pemberton, Porter, and the Mississippi is a character in these stories. And I don't think people realize sort of the challenges of fighting the current and the shifting channel and the degree in which rivers bend, and so you got to make the corners with these big ships, and you've got stuff coming at you all the time, deadheads and logs just getting propelled by the river current, smashing against your hull. Farragut talked about in 1862 about how his boats were just getting beaten up terrible by just all the river detritus coming at him. And so when I think about the personality that Farragut had for that versus the personality that Porter had for that, and Porter just seemed that scrappier kind of guy to me, that like he was into getting it down and dirty with this river that was also down and dirty, and he just seemed like the right man for this job at this right time.
Yeah, Farragut hated being up the river. And he
don't we all though? Don't we all?
Without a paddle in some cases.
So you guys have both alluded to this relationship between Porter and Grant, which we could make a pretty good argument. It's the partnership that wins the war, not the Grant and Sherman thing that most people think of. But like, if it wasn't for Porter, Grant could not have succeeded, and if it wasn't for Grant, Porter could not have succeeded. Dwight, you've written about that quite a bit on the blog and in some of the book collections we've done. Let me have you start out, and then Neil, I'll have you follow up on that.
Yeah, well, when Wells first started talking to Porter about taking over the Mississippi River Squadron, there was another player involved besides, at that point, General Grant, and that was John McClernand. Independent of John McClernand, who was a powerful Illinois politician, went to Lincoln and convinced Lincoln to let him gather up an army, and he was going to come down to Mississippi and take Vicksburg, and he didn't need Grant at all. And so McClernand was kind of starting this process independently. And Porter kind of said, well, I'd rather work with McClernand because he's not a West Pointer. And those West Pointers are really arrogant And Porter didn't think that West Pointer was going to listen to a poor sailor and take advice from him, and he would be subordinate to West Pointer. But anyway, Porter got the position, and he went out to take command of the squadron. And then in November of 1862, and when Porter first met Grant, they were in Cairo, Illinois, where the major naval base was, the only inland naval base at the time.
We better say Cairo, because everybody in Illinois is like,
Cairo.
oh, he's not from around here.
Okay. Anyway, Porter was having dinner on one of the big steamboats there, and Grant came in his rather rumpled civilian clothes, and Porter had never met him before, and was introduced to him. And they sat down, started talking, and Grant started talking about his campaigns and what he wanted to do. And Porter was completely disarmed by this guy. And it turned out, as they got to know each other, that Grant was completely open to listening to a sailor, which Porter didn't really expect. He not only brought Porter in as an equal combined arms commander with his other senior commanders. He listened to him. He took his advice. They worked together, and they actually established an environment where their subordinates could work together in a truly unifying manner. And that had never, almost never happened before. And that's what made it work. and so the Porter-Grant partnership, and Porter also turned out to be, he got along real well with Sherman. And actually Porter and Sherman turned out to be lifelong friends. Porter said he was never really got close to Grant, but he always did exactly what Grant wanted. Porter said he told his men, he said, Grant's orders and Sherman's orders are my orders. And that process mostly worked.
Neil?
Yeah, so they really did get along, and they really did see eye to eye in that it couldn't be an all Navy or an all Army show. So like we talked about the capture of New Orleans in '62. That was essentially an all Navy show. Benjamin Butler's military forces, half of them were still on Ship Island when the city of New Orleans was captured by the U.S. Navy. They weren't operating consistently together. Whereas, the first attempts to capture Vicksburg in '62 really proved that was going to be a different story. You can't just take this giant town on a bluff full of all these heavy guns. The Navy is not going to be able to do it on its own. And then the Army needs Navy support to do it. And so when Grant laid all this out with Porter and basically put all his cards on the table saying, I need you and you need me, Porter was like, oh, this is great. I've got just the person I need to work with. And it really does put into perspective a lot, because Porter's the go-to person after this for large-scale joint military naval expeditions. Porter is in charge of the Mississippi River Squadron in '64 still when the Red River campaign goes through. And yeah, it's a disaster, but Porter is working with the military forces to try to accomplish that mission. And then even at the end of the war, after the disaster of the first assaults against Fort Fisher fail, they call in somebody, they bring in new people. Porter is brought in, he's brought in, and he's basically like, oh, can you cooperate with the new guy? And they fire people and replace them. And the result is Porter is a guy who can work with military leadership if they're willing to work with him. And that's something that is not commonplace amongst many naval leaders. There's a lot of writing in the naval circles of people who study the naval side of the war, where even as the war is ending, there are still only a very handful number of naval officers who can actually coordinate properly with the Army. And the Army has problems coordinating with the Navy even at the end of the war, and they're firing commanders and hand-picking new ones, not so much because they have skills in leading thousands and thousands of men in the field. It's more, can you work with the Navy and can you do a siege? And those are the skill sets that they seek for in these more coastal operations. And so Porter can work with the Army, and he's demonstrated that he can. And so they keep tapping him to do these joint Army Navy expeditions as the war continues.
I've always thought it was telling in that very famous painting called The Peacemakers, where Lincoln is aboard his ship outside City Point and he's meeting with Grant, Sherman, and Porter. And, like, those are the military commanders who have risen to the top and are literally at the very heart of those final decisions. And Porter has earned himself a seat at that table.
Yeah, and you can see this very early because the other aspect of it is the development of amphibious operations with masses of ships and masses of troops and moving them long distances and putting them ashore and covering for them. And Porter's first crack at this was at Chickasaw Bayou. Grant initially had planned to come down the railroad from the north to take Vicksburg. And then he got together with Porter, and they worked out together that there would be a two-pronged plan. He would send Sherman with 32,000 troops down the Mississippi with Porter to Chickasaw Bayou, and Grant would come down the railroad. Well, as we know, Grant got turned back because the rebels got in his rear and took his supply depot, and so he didn't make it. And Grant and Porter and Sherman got down to Chickasaw Bayou, and while it's well recorded, the Chickasaw Bayou was a disaster for Sherman. It's not recognized that it was, as an amphibious operation, a total success, because Porter bought 2 ironclads, 14 clads, almost 60 transports with 32,000 troops, all the way down the river from Memphis and up the Yazoo. He deposited those troops where Sherman wanted them. He protected the troops. He bombarded troop concentrations. He cleared mines. He fought off Confederate gunboats. One of his ironclads, the Cairo, struck a mine and went down in a few minutes. And then when things turned against Sherman, he pulled all those troops back onto his boats and withdrew them. And this turned out to be a massive operation compared to what had happened before in this respect. I mean, nobody had ever done an amphibious operation in the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Army of this size before. And of course, it later even got bigger. I mean, at the end of the war, you have Fort Fisher, which was an even bigger operation. And so it was these amphibious operations that they just did it. I mean, there was no roadmap for these. There were no manuals for this. There was no training for this. And it was a massive logistic and transport operation.
When you mentioned Chickasaw Bayou, and again, that kind of gets me into the Porter's Brownwater mindset, where, people think about all these attempts that Grant makes at Vicksburg over the course of the early months of 1863 before he finally crosses the river. But, like, Porter's right in there with him making these choices. Like, yeah, I'll try the Yazoo Pass thing. Yeah, we'll try Steele's Bayou. Like, he's wanting to also get in there and try to make something happen.
Yeah, Steele's Bayou and Yazoo Pass are amazing operations and rather underappreciated. Here again, you have the U.S. Navy with ironclads and transports and tinclads and hundreds of troops, and they blow up the levees. They flood the cottonland and the forests, and he's pushing these vessels through narrow channels. He's knocking over huge old trees and knocking bridges to kindling, and a whole bunch of the enslaved folks are standing along the banks watching this with their mouths agape. And he's trying to move these troops. Porter and Grant and Sherman tried again to get around to the north and the east of Vicksburg, to get around the Chickasaw Bluffs and the high bluffs to the north of Vicksburg, to get at Vicksburg from the north and the east. And they didn't succeed because the Confederates, they knocked down trees both in front, behind these convoys, and they set up some rudimentary forts and gun emplacements, and they had their sharpshooters out. and Porter and his boats got stuck, and he almost lost some of them, but Sherman brought his troops into the rescue and they backed them all out. But that they would
Yeah,
even
that
try.
was literally like one of those Hollywood rescues that actually really took place. Like Sherman sweeps
Yeah,
in
yeah.
and
That,
saves it.
that the U.S. Navy was even trying some of this stuff is just amazing, and it could have succeeded. I mean, there are you can imagine circumstances if things had been a little different, where they could have broken through, and gotten behind Vicksburg from the north and east in the spring of '63, and got at them that way. But it didn't. So Grant went to Plan C or
Yeah,
D.
yeah.
How
By that
many?
point, he's like, I'm playing G, playing. So Neil, let me ask you: when Porter makes the decision to run the batteries on April 16th, like that's a huge decision to make, because the idea is like if we go downriver, that's fine, but the current is so strong that we can't get past those cannons to go upriver. What's at stake for Porter at that moment, and why does he go for it?
What's at stake at that point is, well, most of his squadron and his entire reputation and his career. I mean, if that would have failed, they fired squadron commanders at that point in the war. They would have just fired him because he would have lost ships and he would have lost his reputation. And relieving squadron commanders for the Navy, it happens, and it happens a lot during the war. They get rotated out pretty consistently when they're not accomplishing something. And so Porter going with Grant's plan to steam past the Vicksburg guns to eventually get to Grand Gulf and to ultimately bring about the facilitation of Grant crossing the river is a huge gambling point for Porter. But it is testament to the fact that he's willing to keep trying different avenues, which I think is something that a lot of people don't give credit to the naval side for. If you haven't been in the U.S. Navy, it's kind of hard to understand the concept, but nothing happens immediately in naval activity. I mean, look at the blockade. When Lincoln said we're going to do a blockade, the U.S. Navy said, well, we don't have the ships, we don't have the sailors, we don't have anything, but we're going to do it. They knew from the get-go that the blockade was going to be a years-long, multi-year process. From the very first day of the war, they already knew it was going to take forever. And the Navy tackled that by, doing what they could and eventually helping to close ports when they could capture them. Naval activity is not an overnight process. Even the big fancy battles. I mean, it took, Porter and Farragut a month to get their ships into the Mississippi River to even start the bombardments of the forts that will get eventually to the capture of New Orleans. And so Porter is part of this mindset in the naval circles of things don't happen immediately. And a setback isn't necessarily a loss. It's just, well, we just have to do the next step to get to the final objective. And if we don't capture the fort today, well, we're still bombarding it. It's still cut off. We'll capture it the next time. And so I think Porter really does exemplify this mindset that a lot of naval officers have. He's extending that mindset into river operations, whereas other naval officers maybe wouldn't be able to do that, but they're also doing that mindset on the coast. And a lot of people, in the military, we're seeing this as like campaigns. We launch a campaign and on to Richmond. Oh, it failed. Well, I guess we'll try again next year or something like that. The Navy does not think like that. They're thinking very consistently, well, we failed today, try again tomorrow. We failed the bombardment this time, we'll launch an assault next time. We failed to attack that fort here. Well, let's get the Marines together on boats and launch an attack later. And so he exemplifies that attitude and then expands that attitude to supporting Grant on the river, when Grant sort of seizes that attitude and gets Porter to exemplify it best. And so they work really well together, I think, because Grant has that can-do attitude and he helps Porter extract that can-do attitude that's hidden inside of all naval officers to the point where they can use it and leverage it to cooperate better.
Kind of along those lines, I think then that maybe we need to give some kudos to Andrew Foote, who sort of sets the table with Grant to put Grant in the mindset of that can-do attitude. So when Porter arrives, Grant has learned from his previous relationship how to then be in this new relationship with Porter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, go ahead, Dwight. Yeah.
Well, that's right. I was just going to mention another aspect of that, and that is that nobody knew how these river warcraft, which had never existed before. I mean, they were invented whole cloth. How they were going to work, in particular the ironclads, the city class ironclads, the Eads ironclads, and the others. And nobody knew how they would do against shore batteries. And there were wildly different opinions on both sides. On the one hand, they were concerned about plunging fire from the heights, because in general the upper decks and the roofs of the casemates were less armored than the sides, and so they were real concerned about plunging fire from the bluffs. And of course, the Vicksburg batteries were way high on the bluffs, some of them, and so it was not a sure thing. I mean, it was not even known. Now, Foote had managed to get his ironclads by Island Number 10, which was one instance. On the other hand, at Fort Donelson, the ironclads had been badly battered by the big guns at Fort Donelson, and so they didn't know how things were going to work, and so Porter lined his craft up, and he matched them up. He put wooden gunboats, lashed them alongside the outboard side, the non-Vicksburg side of these ironclads, so that the ironclad's engine got hit and went out. The gunboat could provide some propulsive power. Also, the gunboats were somewhat protected by the ironclads from the shot from Vicksburg. But anyway, he went very close to the eastern bank, and was generally under the guns of a lot of them, and then the Confederates couldn't depress them fast enough. And of course, these artillery weapons of the time were not trainable in any real sense, so they couldn't adjust to a moving target, which was their primary disadvantage. And so he managed to steam by there with very little. I think he only lost a couple transports, actually, and very few men. And so it worked, but they didn't know for sure about that in advance.
Yeah, big deal. So Porter has an incredible career. He's got many things to crow about. I found, though, when using his post-war writings, that he still was not a reliable narrator of his own events. Either he misremembered things or he exaggerated them. He certainly could turn a phrase really well, which makes his writings really alluring to a historian from that. He gives good sound bites, but like, he's not always reliable. What's been your experience looking at his post-war writings? And there are many.
Sure, I'll go first on this one. So first, he writes a lot post-war. A lot more than any other military or naval officer. He's one of the most prolific post-war writers, period. You say that he writes memoirs. Well, he writes two memoirs. One is a history of the entire Civil War's naval aspects, which is not the most reliable thing. But then he has a second memoir that comes out, Incidents and Anecdotes of the Civil War, which is his own personal recollections and experiences. And that one's a little bit more reliable if you want to look at specifics, because he's writing about things where he was at least present for. Whereas his Naval History of the War book, it's part memoir because he's in a lot of the naval war, but it's also part history, but he's not looking at a lot of records, so to speak, to write that history. It's more of just him writing things out and going, oh, well, I've heard somebody said that this is what it was, so I'll write that down. But there's no official records or anything. Like, they're still making the Navy's official records at that point. So, that's just the way it is. But he writes a whole lot of other stuff. He writes, a book about his dad. He even writes romance novels. He's got a couple of romance novels out there, which are desperately long. They're like 800 pages each. So he's writing a lot more than other people. And yeah, he likes to tell a good story. But reliance on his books, they're great for catching that anecdote that you want to add, and then this battle took place and future Admiral David Porter said this. That's a great quote that you can use to sum up a situation. but like a minute by minute play by, he's not the most reliable person for that. And his letters are much better for that. His personal letters and so on in the archives are much better than his memoirs in that respect.
Dwight, what's your experience reading him after the
Yeah,
war?
well, I agree with him. You have to be very careful because he is so quotable. His prose is just wonderfully colorful, and so when you're quoting a visual impression of something he's actually seen and he writes this down, that's great. but Neil's right. If you're going to look at the details of what actually happened, particularly if he wasn't there, then you have to compare it with other other sources to make sure that that's really what happened. But he's fun guy to read.
Fun guy to read for sure. So as we wrap up our discussion, and Dwight, I'll have you start. What's your final assessment of David Dixon Porter?
Oh, I think he's great. I love him. He's and we can't forget his subsequent service at Fort Fisher, which was the biggest amphibious operation, and 600 naval gun bombardment, and that kind of an amphibious operation, support operation, didn't happen until, well, the Pacific War, or maybe Gallipoli or someplace like that. But I'm a fan of Porter, so recognizing his faults, but they just give him interest and color.
I will say you're a fan of Porter, but you're not as big a fan of Porter as Porter was, right?
Well, nobody could be.
Neil, how about you? Your final assessment.
David Dixon Porter is a really good case study to look at. He's great for bookending the Civil War in itself. I mean, he was in D.C. the day that the people in D.C. found out South Carolina seceded. He's like talking to Southern politicians in D.C. He's part of that relief expedition. That is it going to Fort Sumter? Is it going to Fort Pickens? So he's involved in the very early stages of the conflict. He's on the blockade. He's on the Mississippi River. He commands ships. He commands squat flotillas, whole naval squadrons. He starts the war as a lowly lieutenant, the equivalent army captain. He ends the war as a rear admiral sitting in the room with Abraham Lincoln on the ship, talking big strategy. He's in Richmond, Virginia, the day Lincoln's in Richmond, Virginia. In fact, Porter sneaks into Richmond before Lincoln gets there. And when Lincoln's ship is going up to Richmond, Virginia to dock at the wharves, they run into a little tugboat, and David Dixon Porter's on the tugboat going, oh, yeah, right over here's a good spot.
Oh, look who happens to be here. Oh, my gosh.
He's definitely got the characteristics of a good story. And that's really awesome because he can exemplify, that low rank to high rank rise, that obscurity to, top running of operations, and that shift in mindset that happens during the Civil War. And that's why he stays around after the war and becomes a full admiral and goes to the U.S. Naval Academy. They keep him around because they think that he's got the mentality to keep going. And while there's arguments about his post-war activity at the Naval Academy, he kind of guts the U.S. Navy's steam engineering program for a while. But he is a great figure to study for the Civil War, mainly because he's involved in so much of it. He's involved in New Orleans, he's involved in Vicksburg, he's involved at Fort Fisher, he's on the Mississippi River, he's at the Red River, he's on the blockade, he's in DC, he's kind of all over the place, and he's in that system much more than many other officers are, except for your Grants and your Shermans. And so he fits really well into that picture. And so he's an awesome character to study when people want to study the naval aspects of the Civil War, mainly because he's got his hand in so many hats in that system.
Well, Dwight, Neil, I have had a great time chatting with you about I feel like an old Navy guy just spinning some yarns. I feel like I should say arg or something like that.
Sea stories.
Yeah, sea stories. Yeah, exactly.
River stories.
Dwight, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Neil, thanks for being with us tonight.
Glad to be here.
On behalf of my colleagues, I'm Chris Mikowski. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We will see you online, on the waves, and on the battlefield.